Hello and welcome, students. We are starting this chapter here on political violence, chapter 11. We are getting closer to the end of the term. Um, and so let's go ahead and point out some things that I want to run through. This is sort of just my outline. But as you can imagine, right, this chapter is all about political violence outside this control of states. And so this is violence carried out by states. It's a subject of various in the previous chapter on non-democratic regimes and violence between states, which is a more of a subject for an international politics course. But a key theme that runs through this chapter is that violence by non-state actors really takes on several different forms. It can be explained by referring to institutions, ideology, and individual personalities, and that responding to violence, it really represents a dilemma for modern states because, well, as you can imagine, most states don't want to really have to be confronted by political violence that is happening either from the outside or within their own domestic constituents. So the state is really the cornerstone of modern politics, and it's expected that the state should be the one who's really, holding a monopoly of violence over a territory. Whether you agree with that or not is neither here nor there. But that really is, the power of the police is something maybe, if you're speaking about it domestically, could be better situated for an American government course. But really, the state does have sort of a monopoly on how they leverage violence over a territory. Of course, citizens of various countries and states are offered all kinds of rights. For us, it's the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. But political violence in this kind of context is outside of this, what we would, kind of think of as typical state monopoly. And so we're focusing on political violence, which differs from crime. Although there may be crime taking place within the political violence, we do need to distinguish between those two things. While some of the activities may be similar to crime, the motivation for it is significantly different. Crime is really, could be carried out for economic reasons or because a perpetrator enjoys the violence, but it lacks a specific political goal, which we'll get into terrorism in a bit here and discuss that in the second half mostly. But for our purposes, political violence is violence that is carried out for the specific purpose of achieving some sort of political goal. There's got to be political end to this violence that is taking place. Otherwise, we don't really consider it to be a topic of our discussion. So, why do some people, but not others, engage in political violence? Why do they engage in violence only in some places and at some times? These are really good questions that political scientists have tried to study over the years. Um, there really are these three kinds of explanations that follow in the next few slides. These explanations are often complementary to one another, as using all three approaches may give us a better understanding, a more holistic understanding of the complex elements that are motivating individuals to carry out political violence when the consequences from the state could be very heavy-handed. In many cases, the death penalty, especially when if you're thinking about like the anthrax scare that the United States had in 2001, and really there's, the FBI claimed that it was one individual. Now, we're never really going to know the full truth because that individual had committed suicide. Um, and so I guess it really And we're going after the death penalty on this person is kind of what I'm trying to get at here with the anthrax scare, even though it was coming from um, somebody, it was likely coming from somebody inside the United States. And so what would motivate somebody to do that, right? It's a question that we seek to answer. But if the question is why do some people engage in violence but others do not, then we really need to account for some kind of variation. Institutional arguments are based on the premise that institutions vary more than things such as grievances, so that if we want to understand the causes of a revolution, we need to look at the institutions. We have other research on civil wars that has linked presidential systems and systems that use a winner take all method or rules that are set up, such as plurality systems, to more violence. In these systems, minorities may be permanently denied access to power, which could lead them to turn to violence as a means of correcting this exclusion that they're faced with. And so, for this is the main driver for why many scholars suggest that they should be using either proportional representation or preferential voting systems in a multi-ethnic society, which would allow for a greater representation of voices. Okay, we have ideational explanations. Ideation simply means having to do with ideas. It's a pretty straightforward term. The impact of ideas depends on context. Ideas that are radical or reactionary within their society are more likely to lead people to reject existing institutions and to seek a replacement for those with new ones that would conform to their values. So, some types of ideologies may be especially prone to encouraging violence. For instance, groups like ISIS or Boko Haram, they use religious fundamentalism to justify violence against non-Muslims. And every major religion has really produced, or there can be found some fundamentalists there who are willing to engage in violence. The 969 movement is a Buddhist nationalist movement in Myanmar. Former name of that country is Burma. And Christian fundamentalism is a major element in white supremacist violence that's found in the United States, like the Oklahoma City bombing that was carried out by Timothy McVeigh. It did take the U.S. government quite some time before they would officially label the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 as terrorism. Broad ideas that are outside of religion can be some very powerful motivators. To maintain stability, states rely on ideas of legitimacy, meaning that people can accept that it's right and proper for the state or the regime to rule. And so when states lack this legitimacy, people feel that they have the right to rebel. There's a power vacuum taking place there. Somebody's going to fill it. But all of you as students should really take note that this argument does not contradict institutional or individual theories. These ideational conditions can combine with them to make violence either more likely or less likely, or unlikely, I should say. Um, Individual explanations focus on individual decision making. These explanations may focus on personal experiences, or they can apply to more general human cognition processes to explain personal motivations. Most people who study political violence argue that rather than a cognitively deviant act, it reflects a rational cost benefit analysis, right, where you're maximizing the benefits and minimizing the costs or risks associated with your decision. Maybe not from our personal point of view. We may not agree with that or take that at face value, but from the point of view of the person engaging in the violence, certainly makes sense in their mind. And so as an example, when we have socioeconomic experiences that create feelings of desperation or depression, a desire for liberation or a social solidarity with a group or a cause, which in turn can motivate that individual to take up arms, or motivate them for violence. The event that sparked the Arab Spring was really, it was a cause, started off with a fruit vendor in Tunisia who lit himself on fire. And by all accounts, this fruit vendor was driven by frustrations with his economic circumstances and by the humiliating treatment that was given to him by government authorities within Tunisia. And so, fitting with this rational actor approach, other people who engage in political violence may be doing so for economic reasons. Many of ISIS's fighters from developing countries like Tunisia and Sudan, they and well elsewhere too. I mean, there's more than just Tunisia and Sudan. Obviously, they're coming from Afghanistan and Iraq, Oman and Yemen, etc. They can be fighting for economic reasons. If you're giving these fighters $150 a day, for example, which is by all accounts in the New York Times from a 2014 article, um, cites this $150 pay scale that they're offered every day, right? That's a way better economic opportunity than what they can, make at home, which, they're motivated by a paycheck, as my slide states. 150 bucks a day versus, you know, maybe $2 a day or even less than $2 a day, working a hard manual labor job. Okay, demonstrating how these approaches should be thought of as complementary rather than competing explanations. That is really a description of the Syrian conflict. It can be understood through these three approaches. And so, if we're going to go ahead and run through some of those, the institutional approach, the Syrian regime under Assad was highly patrimonial with a monopoly of power that was held by the Assad family, and the minority is the Alawite sect. Most of the population is really denied access to power. The Sunni population, in particular, has been predisposed to protest. Going back to the 1980s, protests by this population led to a brutal crackdown by the Assad regime, which left the message that peaceful, contentious activities, such as peaceful protests, they wouldn't really be tolerated or allowed. Moving to the ideational explanation, with support from foreign actors like Saudi Arabia, one of the largest militant groups to emerge following the initial protest was the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, ISIS, a group that's really built on the remnants of the former terrorist group Al Qaeda in Iraq. So this group conducted a brutal campaign against the government and against more moderate elements in the insurgency. Often they really focused more on the moderate insurgency, and their overall goal was to create their own state governed by severe religious law. Moving to the individual explanation, the initial protests prior to the escalation of violence were motivated by people who were frustrated with the regime's corruption and with the rising cost of housing. When the government responded to these protests by firing on the crowds and torturing protesters in prison and elsewhere, the initial peaceful protests quickly descended into violence against the regime. And those those protests were put down by the Assad regime in short order. So we have riots, assassinations, and civil wars. Those are all examples of political violence. We focus on two: revolution and terrorism, and not as much on civil wars. But those two in particular, revolution and terrorism, have a lot of substantive importance. And so, if you notice on both cases, this form of political violence is carried out by individual citizens and not by government agents. A second similarity is that both revolution and terrorism They're really seeking to replace or abolish existing economic and political institutions. And given that both forms of violence seek revolutionary change, it's probably unsurprising that the two events that are often linked, those two parts of it, revolutionary change and, or excuse me, abolishing existing economic and political institutions. The first terrorists were really part of, those kind of people who were involved or participating in the French Revolution. Mass uprisings, even if they don't result in regime change, those can profoundly change politics, making it a worthwhile study. And terrorism may be less likely to result in profound political change, but it does represent a major challenge to modern political institutions. Looking towards revolution, it's not just the replacement of the government, that people who hold certain offices at a particular time, but its revolution is really the replacement of an entire regime. So, since there are so many revolutions that involve violence, people sometimes assume this is a defining element of revolution. Um, well, Thomas Jefferson has a famous quote about, you know, kind of watering the tree of liberty with the blood of revolutionaries, and that we need to have a good revolution every 10 years. Um, so some of those revolutions could be peaceful, depending on how you're interpreting that. But getting back to the Eastern European revolutions that overthrew communism in 1989, those were largely peaceful. Romania had experienced some significant violence. They're a little bit of an outlier. And so, violence in this sense, it represents a choice. It occurs only if the current regime decides to use force to stay in power, or if the revolutionary forces decide to use violence to achieve their desired change. It's important to keep in mind that not all regime changes are revolutions. Coup d'etats, which is a French word, it's coup d'etat because it's a regime overthrow by a small group. We wouldn't really define it as a revolution. Negotiated transitions, like in South Africa, are also elite driven. So scholars really hesitate to call those a revolution. Secessionist movements who seek to either um, more local control or complete independence from a state, those would not be considered a revolution because they're not seeking to gain control of the central government. So those people who claim that they're going to secede from the Union, like in Texas, or if we look to Canada and Quebec, those are not under the umbrella of revolutions. Okay, we have here on this slide different theories and explanations that have dominated the field at different times. Today, scholars really try to integrate multiple approaches to understanding when and why revolutions occur. Relative deprivation theories developed out of social movements, research, they try to explain the motivators for broad collective action. This kind of theory, it really argues that people seek to change the system when they're frustrated with the status quo. As it focuses on individual motivations, it should be grouped with individual explanations rather than those ideational or institutional ones, when we're looking at why political violence bubbles up and takes place. But under this approach, revolution may emerge under a couple of different conditions. Number one, if modernization rapidly changes a society. So oftentimes we'll have a political system that's failing to keep up with the population's changing expectations, failing to provide the policy goods or political rights that a population has come to expect. That's one condition. The second condition could be when some groups are benefiting more than the state, from the state than others. If we have an oligarchy like in Russia, those definitely having groups that are benefiting more from the state than others. It's just widening that sort of socioeconomic gap, right, between the haves and the have-nots, or the rich and the poor. This is really the relative part of deprivation theory. Individuals need some group to which they compare themselves, the group that creates the expectation of how things should be. If a small elite, if we could, a small elite group could be ethnic, racial, or class, is doing much better than others economically or politically, the masses might want to, mobilize to challenge this privilege. So some revolutions seem to fit well with relative deprivation explanations. Iran during the 1970s, they had rapid development under the Shah, which led to greater demands for political freedom. Similarly, Egypt's revolutions seem to have been triggered, at least in part, by high youth unemployment and the frustrations that this had sort of created. Other countries, like in Japan and possibly China, they have achieved significant social and economic change without triggering a widespread revolution. And that sort of, to me, suggests that this model is a poor predictor of regime stability. Although I should mention that China is experiencing roughly 20 or 25% youth unemployment. And Iran is experiencing a time in which they have a very high percentage of their population is young people. I forget what the numbers are, but like I said, it's a real high percentage when you compare it to different age categories, particularly older folks in Iran, older cohorts, but they have a young population, ages 18 to 30, huge percentage. So it's sort of low hanging fruit. It's ripe for revolution right now. But those two countries do have government regimes that, at least in the past, when you consider them being pretty well equipped to put down any kind of revolution that might take place, especially when you look at China with Tiananmen Square. So different theories and explanations have really dominated. That's the takeaway. The field at different times. Today, scholars try to integrate multiple approaches to understanding when and why revolutions occur. That relative deprivation theories developed out of social research. They try to, you know, they're really are trying to sorry about that, to figure out social movement research. They're trying to explain those motivators for broad collective action. And so a second approach is represented in Theda Skocpol's famous work, State and Social Revolutions. In it, she argues that revolutions require a specific set of conditions. First, competition with rival states can betray state weakness. The second point that she makes in her book is that weaker states may seek to institute reform to increase their autonomy or capacity, but there's the reforms that take place can challenge existing power structures and sow discord within the regime. So an example of a revolution triggered by institutional factors would be France in 1789. War with England led to higher taxes and centralization, which triggered a revolt. Similarly, Russia's revolution was made possible by the failure of Tsarist Russia in World War I. Institutional approaches also have poor predictive issues. They really ignore the role of ideas and individuals when making revolution happen. The fall of communism in Eastern Europe was triggered by changes in the international arena, especially with the Soviet Union's loosening control and internal failures within each state. But it also inspired, it was inspired by opposition leaders strongly influenced by the ideas of liberalism, human rights, and nonviolent protest. You know, when we think of nonviolent protest, we must think of Mahatma Gandhi. The Arab Spring was inspired by the actions of one person, um, and that really resonated strongly with Arab populations, led to protests across the Arab world that and coordinated through Facebook. They were demanding dignity and political reform. So in the picture above, we have Egyptian protesters that are gathering at Tahrir Square in Cairo. This is the start of the Egyptian revolution, which overthrew Mubarak, who had been in power for roughly 35 years. This Egyptian revolution took place in 2011. So we sort of there's actually kind of two interesting questions that are taking place here, or that are posed by this section that we're going to get into. Why did these revolutions occur in 2010 and 2011? And why did Tunisia's revolution lead to peaceful democratic regime change, while other movements like in Egypt and Syria led to retaliatory state violence and revolution failure? Certainly, the Arab Spring was feared in Syria, and I think to an extent in Russia, Putin was taking, kind of looking around and noticing what was going on, and was afraid that this kind of color revolution could be right at the front doorstep in Moscow. It certainly was in Ukraine. But let's stick to the Arab Spring questions that I'm posing here. Why 2011? Well, let's run through three of them: institutional, ideational, and individual. As far as the institutional piece goes, the Arab world in 2011 was comprised of some of the most repressive and exclusionary regimes in modern politics. If we look back to Scopel's states and social revolutions, some of these authoritarian regimes had actually undergone recent reforms. Most notably with Syria's Assad regime, they had liberalized their economy and political system, but there was widespread drought that took place for 4 years from 2006 to 2010, and that really exacerbated socioeconomic differences. The ideational bit is groups like the April 6th movement in Egypt. They were shaping the message of the protesters. They focused on issues of regime corruption, loss of dignity, and took their inspiration from successful protest movements in Eastern Europe. These movements also copied one another. And so when the April 6th movement saw Tunisia's protesters bring down their government, they launched their own protests, which ultimately unseated the Mubarak dictatorship, right? And then on the individual level, these events were sparked by the actions of one individual, right? Mohamed Bouazizi of Tunisia. In December of 2010, Bouazizi, a 26-year-old who was working as a fruit seller, stood before the local governor's office, doused himself in gasoline, and set himself on fire. And so, fitting with that relative deprivation approach, Bouazizi's experience had really resonated with the masses in Tunisia. A lot of youth had felt especially frustrated by the lack of jobs and the failings of these governments. Protests began soon thereafter, spread across the region, raising common demands for some of that dignity and change. So, kind of taking a more holistic approach here. The other major question raised is why Tunisia's revolution led to a peaceful democratic transition while the rest of the region saw violence that emerged and non-democracy strengthen. Egypt had a brief regime change that ended in a military coup, while Syria completely devolved into civil war. So the revolutions that became violent, they have a few common features that I'm going to go ahead and run through. Regimes with stronger militaries and more patrimonial systems like Syria and Egypt, they respond to changes to their power by repressing and putting down the population. While in Tunisia, they had a weak military. Syria, in particular, had both the desire and the means to use violence against their opponents. Countries with more moderate elements, like Tunisia, had all actors supporting democratic reforms, such as Tunisia's Islamic Party. And in comparison, more fundamentalist voices like Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, they really kind of were charged with polarizing the population and made the public more accepting, at least in a temporary sense, of a military coup. Political leaders, this is my third and final point on this. Political leaders of these movements chose to either compromise, the compromise took place in Tunisia, or they choose to escalate in response to state violence. And the escalation came from Syria and in the transition, post transition world in Egypt a little bit. So we're going to get into the section on terrorism. While there are a lot of different definitions of terrorism, and it's highly important to consistently use the definition that one gives throughout as our starting point. Um, depending on how someone defines terrorism will also depend on how they craft their arguments. But the definition that I have here on the slide, it reflects one that's used by the State Department and a number of other terrorist scholars. State-sponsored terrorism may have a state funding a group, but the actual organization and membership are non-state actors. And I want to go ahead and break here because there's a lot of ground to cover for our second half.